So here's another science name that you should recall. Charles Darwin, okay, in the mid-1800s, came up with this idea that I've been describing. He called it natural selection. And basically, it's organisms that have traits that allow them to adapt better to their environment, will have a higher survival rate, and they'll be able to reproduce and have more offspring than organisms in the population that have adaptations that don't fit as well to that environment. Not like Mendel, Darwin didn't know anything about genes. So my modern explanation a few slides back, that individuals that had the better adaptations that allow them to survive better, reproduce more successfully, and because they reproduce more, they left alleles in the population for those adaptations, those traits, those favorable traits. It allowed for the gene pool of that population to increase those alleles in the population because they were leaving more offspring that had their adaptations coded for in their DNA. Now, of course, Darwin didn't know anything about genes or gene pools or anything like that. That's me putting it in modern terms, because what we know about genes and DNA and protein synthesis. So Darwin saw all kinds of different adaptations depending on the different places that he visited. He was the naturalist on this British ship that was looking for places that it could colonize because of economic things that they could profit from. The king would profit from in England. So he was paid to observe nature and record what he saw so that England could maybe colonize the places that looked favorable for something that would bring income to England. So you can see he went around the world and he saw many different places in the north and in the south and in the tropical places as well. So he had lots of observations to make this conclusion about natural selection. Probably the most significant place he visited were the Galapagos Islands, right here. There was a huge amount of biodiversity in the types of finches, a bird. It was obvious to him that all these different types of finches had arisen from some common ancestor that wasn't around anymore, because over time he figured, because of competition, the finches had to compete with each other. The finches with for the food on these islands. So their beak became very different because each beak shape would be an adaptation to a specific kind of food that other birds with different beaks wouldn't be competing for. So there arose a great number of different finches, and these finches became different species over time. So what do I mean by that? Like a finch with a beak that could break a big nut couldn't mate with a finch with a pointed beak that was used to spear insects out of holes in trees or in the ground. So he jumped to the idea that from microevolution, we had macroevolution occurring over a long period of time in order to reduce competition for one kind of food. Also, he saw long-necked turtles on islands in the Galapagos that had tall plants. So these guys evolved where there were taller plants, and short-necked tortoises where the plants grew close to the ground. So another adaptation that caused two different species from what was one kind of tortoise. So here's a picture of some of the different species of finches, and you can see that depending on the type of beak, depends on what kind of food they specialized on eating. So it's pretty cool that he observed all this. And he wrote about it in his book, The Origin of Species, which was like a long explanation of evidence for macroevolution. So these are points that I just mentioned. Microevolution requires mutations. He didn't know about mutations, what caused the diversity in traits that he saw. But we know it was mutations that produce a different kind of trait. And those are random. The animal or plant that's mutating doesn't will it to happen. It just happens spontaneously. And if it's a new trait that is beneficial, we call that an adaptation. Okay, also that the these traits were inherited in the offspring. That's what caused the population gradually to have a higher frequency of the successful traits. Now, he didn't know that it was because of the genes that coded for the proteins that made those traits, like we know now. Okay, because there are limited resources, think about the food. There's going to be competition within a population to obtain those resources. And any adaptation that reduces the competition, because like with the finches, competition was reduced with the different shaped beaks that arose from mutations. So more biodiversity within the population, and eventually these different beaked finches would gradually become new species in the sense that they couldn't reproduce with other finches in the same or at least they were in the same population. Okay, we'll talk about how that happens later. Also, the ones with the better adaptations will obviously get more food. And if you can provide food, you're going to be a good provider. So when you reproduce, you can feed your offspring as well. So the best adaptations allow you to also, in the long run, when all is said and done, if you can't reproduce, I don't care how good your adaptation is, your genes aren't going to grow in the population gene pool. Then, of course, this happens, macroevolution happens over a long period of time. Microevolution happens fairly quickly, comparatively. So everywhere Darwin looked, he saw variation within a population. And here's some drawings he made of, they didn't have cameras back then. Here's some drawings he made of barnacles in a population with different forms of their chalky secreted shell there. So it wasn't new what Darwin was saying. He just put it together with lots of evidence from what he saw around the world. For example, people knew that the children inherited traits from their parents. They didn't understand how. They didn't understand about genes and chromosomes and meiosis. But they understood this from looking at their families and looking at the offspring of their pets or their cattle and their horses and whatever. And they also understood that some traits are beneficial, helpful for getting the animal or plant to be successful at growing, getting food, and other adaptations disadvantageous. So, when organisms die, of course, they get buried over time if we don't purposely bury them. They get buried over time. And as other, the layers of the earth continue to rise, but that's because mountains wear down slowly by erosion, and eventually everything gets covered. So what happens is the deeper we dig, the more back in time we go. The deeper we dig into the soil, into the layers of the crust, the Earth's crust, the older the fossils will be. Okay, so we can get an idea in sedimentary rock at least. Sedimentary rock is layers of what was once soil and life that died, got pressed down and turned to rock over time. So the deeper we dig, the deeper in time we go, the more in the past. So that proved to Darwin that life changed, the species of life changed over deep time. Now, he lived in the Victorian ages, and people had all kinds of, the museum had all kinds of fossils that gave evidence for this. And people could figure out, natural selection because they understood artificial selection, or humans when humans select in a, let's say, a litter of kitties, humans select the cute ones, and they let the other ones, go, and then they breed the kitties, the kittens that the kitties grow into, with other kittens with cute features, and so eventually they've selected this cat with really cute features that they think are cute. We do that with our cattle over 10,000 years of breeding. We do that with anything: horses, dogs, crops. Like I said before, corn. That fruit of corn stocked with tons of seeds, corn kernels. That was artificially selected from natural corn that only had probably like 10 little kernels on it. Now, Darwin was a genius in that he, looking at all the evidence, he came up with this idea of a common ancestor. Common ancestor is what the species was, a population was before it became different, similar species. Now, again, speciation is when, we haven't said how this happens yet, but speciation is when one species turns into another species over time, or several other species over time. So one species evolves into two or more. Well, it could be one or more new species. Now, when I say a new species, you couldn't take the new species individual and try to mate him or her with the original species that it evolved from, because they won't produce children anymore. That's the definition of a new species. So here's some notes from Darwin. And right here, this guy right here is a species that evolved into two species here. Now, this species went extinct because I don't see it continuing. Maybe. This species that evolved from number one branched off into three species. This species right here branched off into two. Then one branched off of there. Each time you get a new branch, that's a new species. Now, I can't read his notes that much, but right here is a common ancestor of these two guys, these two species. That guy doesn't live anymore. That common ancestor doesn't live. He went extinct, or he evolved into two different species. This guy down here is the common ancestor of everyone, everything. So that guy right there. Then here's a speciation event, breaking into two species. Right here is a speciation event breaking into three species. Each branch is a new species. Where the branches meet is a common ancestor of whatever the species the branches represent. This is called a phylogenetic tree. And Darwin was the first guy to come up with this. Tree of life. So Darwin believed that things gradually change. And this is what he calls descent with modification. Now, I don't know. That's like microevolution. The new adaptations gradually pile up until the thing's a new species, because so many things, so many adaptations now are different than they were with the original form of that species. So he thought this was a gradual event. Okay, here they're explaining a phylogenetic tree of a cat, which is on the next page. So right here, we start here. This is kind of a top view of the tree from above. Okay, you're looking down on a forest, and here's one of the trees. Okay, there's a common ancestor. That's like the trunk of the tree of cats. Whatever that looked like, I don't know. I'm sure they have fossils that they can imagine what it looks like. But anyway, every time it branched out into all kinds of different cats. Now, these guys can reproduce with each other, so all cats can reproduce with other cats because they haven't changed into a different species yet, even though they look very, very different. Same with dogs. All dogs can mate with any other dog. So a Chihuahua could mate with a Great Dane and produce a puppy. That would still be a dog. Now, wolves, there are different species than dogs. So a wolf and a dog are not going to be able to mate. Or if they do, their mating won't be very successful. Maybe most of the zygotes will form embryos that are spontaneously aborted by the mother. So we can say that, just looking at it, we can say number 53 and 58 are more related than number 53 and 98. We can say that these species are the most recent species. I'm saying species. I should say what subspecies they are, or race. Same with people. All the different kind of humans on the world can mate and produce offspring unless there's an issue with, the sex organs. But so there's no different species of humans anymore. There used to be, like, Neanderthal man is a different species than Homo sapiens, which is the species that modern humans are. Also, that's the common ancestor of all cats, but every time there's a branching, that's the common ancestor of the branches that follow. So that nodule, that branching, is a common ancestor of all these guys right here. That branching is a common ancestor of all these branches here. This is a more recent common ancestor of these two branches. So the nearer the branches are, in the sense of where they branch off, the closer related they are. Here's how I see most phylogenetic trees, like this. Instead of like a top view, this would be like a knockdown tree, vertical view. I'm sorry, horizontal view. Okay, so if you go, all the branches converge right here. So there's a common ancestor of all of these vertebrates. Vertebrates are animals with backbones, as we'll find out later. Okay, so these are more primitive. I mean, this is, we can see that the fish evolved first, and then tetrapods, which have 4 limbs, evolved next, and branched off into all these different types of 4-legged or 4-limbed animals. Now even snakes, they don't show snakes, but snakes come off here somewhere. And snakes really, you can see in their skeletons these little tiny things that used to be limbs, bones, and hips, which they don't have it. They don't use anymore, of course, because they don't have any limbs. So if I ask you who's more related to us, a dog or a mouse, who's more related to us? Well, all you do is go back to the common ancestor. And a mouse is more related to us because we share a common ancestor more recently than we do with the dog. With the dog, there's our common ancestor right there. So we share a common ancestor more recently with the mouse. So you should be able to do that. So we have 3 super kingdoms or domains, like I said before. Eubacteria, Archaea, which are the prokaryotes, and Eukarya, which are eukaryotes. Then we have 5 kingdoms of eukaryotes. We got the plant kingdom, the fungi kingdom, the animal kingdom, protist kingdom. That's 4. Sorry, that's 4. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. These guys are kind of like fungal, like protist. These guys are like animal, like protist. So we really have, here's a protist, and here's other. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4 kingdoms of eukaryotes. Okay, and then we already talked about Eubacteria and Archaea already. Now, who are we more related to, the Archaea or the bacteria? So all the red ones are the Archaea. There's a common ancestor of Archaea and all the eukaryotes. So we're more related to the Archaea than the Eubacteria. Here's the common ancestor to all living things. Well, actually, that's where the common ancestor evolved into bacteria and Archaea. So the common ancestor is really right down here where this branch is. Okay, phylogenetic tree is weird. It has a combination of archaea and bacteria. Because, why? Because the first eukaryotic cell was probably, the mitochondria that look like little bacteria in the chloroplast, that look like photosynthetic bacteria, mitochondria. And even the nucleus. These organelles, we believe, were once bacteria or archaea, and they got enclosed in a membrane, and they had, that was an adaptation that allowed that cell, that supercell, to work more efficiently, to obtain energy better. And so that cell evolved into a eukaryotic cell. So that's called the endosymbiosis theory. Now, of course, this isn't Darwin at all. It's just kind of modern day thinking. So endosymbiosis is that the eukaryotic cell evolved from archaea and bacteria living together and forming a eukaryotic cell. Okay, theory of evolution that competed with Darwin's theory was Lamarck's theory called inheritance of acquired characteristics. Okay, so here's the example he used to explain it. So you have a population of giraffes with short necks than the ones we have today. This was in the past. Okay, now, they ate fine. They ate they could reach up and eat the leaves off of shrubs and tall shrubs and trees. But when that food resource got limited, because the population of short-necked giraffes grew, they stretched their necks harder. They stretched them, and they worked hard to get those leaves that were on the next higher level. Now, that trying by these giraffes, that attempt, that working out to get the higher leaves, somehow sent a message to their sperm and egg. That's what Lamarck thought. And gave that sperm or egg an advantage, so that when that egg or sperm was fertilized by another giraffe's egg or sperm, it became an individual with a longer, slightly longer neck. And over the years, over the generations, that attempting, that working out to grasp for the higher leaves was benefiting the offspring who grew genetically with, because their genetics was changed to giraffes with slightly longer necks. Makes a lot of sense, but there's no evidence for that. And you can't, let's say you work out in the gym every day and you get super strong. That is not going to give any benefit to your sperm and let your kid get a head start on being jacked. Okay? Okay, let's answer some of you questions. The different types of finches, birds on the Galapagos Island arose because all the types of finches that have been on the island since Earth. Oh, come on. Islands are formed from volcanoes. that wear down. And so the way finches evolved, existed when Earth was formed. Each finch's beak changes during its lifetime. No, unless he broke it or something. No. Those changes in the beak, those adaptations, occurred because of mutations, random events, and they didn't show up in its lifetime. It showed up in their offspring. And then, again, what it was eating didn't change their beak. It was a random mutation in the gene so that you had this allele that formed a shorter, a different shape, a stronger beak. Birds all had a common ancestor, but populations of them were changing over time. Well, that's true. We assumed that it had a common ancestor, and depending on what island it was on, what food sources were there, those populations changed so that the birds that had adaptations that allowed them to eat a certain kind of food in that region would reproduce and have more kids, and those population gene pools would change. All the birds would survive, whatever that means. I have no clue. So letter C. So why do some finches have beak shapes that are shaped for a specific kind of food in their ecosystem? Let's see, natural selection pressures such as food availability determine which beak size will become common in populations over time. That seems right. Well, I don't like how it's worded exactly, but let's look at some other choices, see if they're better. Birds travel ecosystems to have foods they can eat. No, those birds with different kind of beaks did not come from somewhere else and settle in a place that their beak fit the food. That's not true. Birds who cannot eat much put more energy into reproduction. What? If you can't eat much, you're not going to have energy to put into reproduction. Birds live in ecosystems that have a vast array of food sources suitable for any beak size. No. Certain regions don't have nuts. Certain regions on these islands don't have fruit. They have insects. So depending on the environment they are, depends on what food source there is available. And so there's certain beaks that are adapted to specialize on breaking up or obtaining specific types of foods. So letter A is the best choice. Okay, variation in a population is due to what? The barnacles are suffering from infection. Oh, come on. Variation benefits the population because it ensures at least some will survive and reproduce no matter, even when the environment changes. So that sounds really good because biodiversity benefits the population because some will have, even when the environment changes, some of those weird traits will become adaptive, whereas they weren't adapted before. So that's it. Variation does not benefit the population. That's not true. Predator birds prefer to eat a variety of... What? Good fiction. Okay, letter B is the right choice. Pigeon breeders that breed pigeons. Okay, that is artificial selection because we are breeding pigeons. We're picking the ones that are the fastest ones, and we're keeping those as the breeder pigeons taking advantage of what concept? Traits are not inherited. Oh, come on. Traits appear random in each generation. That's true, but they're not taking advantage of that. Pigeons will only breed under specific... That's terrible. External forces can cause populations to change. Yeah, external forces like artificial selection. You create a force by picking out the birds that are fastest and let the other ones not be breeders for you, because you want the pigeon babies to be inherit those traits for fast flying. Okay, a fossil that looks like a giant anteater. Okay, we're assuming that there are no giant anteaters currently in modern times. Is evidence of what? Many species become extinct. Well, not many. One, the giant anteater went extinct. I wouldn't say that's many, just based on that. Fossils are made. What? Species must change over time. Okay, so I would say C is correct. Many species do become extinct, but just one case doesn't prove that many do. So I would even say A and C as the correct choice. Okay, this kind of question, I mean, they could be more straightforward with it. Let's try it. Organisms competing. So they're competing for mates, they're competing for food, they're competing for water, but they're also being eaten by predators. So there's that limitation to their life. Okay, so let's see. It's evidence for what? So competition and evading predators is evidence for what? Ecosystems provide enough resources for a that's probably true, but it's not evidence for what we just mentioned up here. Organisms with the best adaptations had the highest reproductive rates. Me just reading this right here does not prove this true statement, even though it is a true statement. Hopefully it's this. Organisms compete for limited resources, okay, duh. And so some do not survive. Yeah, well, some don't have the ability, the adaptations that allow them to get food more efficiently. So they don't have time to leave offspring. Maybe if they can't get enough food, they'll be more apt to have low energy and more probably be caught and eaten. So I'm going for letter D right here. Not all of the above. All living things have characteristics in common, and species can be very, very closely or distantly related. So that's when we're talking about this. Like, here's species C, here's species A and B. A and B and C share common characteristics because they have a common ancestor right here. But A and B are more closely related. They share more characteristics than species A and C. That's what they're saying. All species have in common, but the tree of life has many branches. Okay, that's true. Animal plants each have their own tree of life. Each species is needed to carry out a unique role on the planet. Well, that's okay, but it doesn't explain Um, I'm not concluding that from what's given up here. So, species changed in the past. No, are stable. No, they're constantly changing, even now. So I would say letter A is the best. Which of the following leads to biodiversity in ecosystem? Natural selection does. Competition does. Inheritance of genes. Yeah. Genes code for the traits that can be adaptive. So all the above in this case. According to this tree of life, I call a phylogenetic tree, a human is more closely related to which one? Okay, here's the human. And elephants right here. Mouse, we already showed the mouse. Armadillos way, I don't know, right there. Okay, so all you do is go back and see who has the newest common ancestor to us on this table. It would be the mouse. All the other ones are further to the left, further to the common ancestor to all, which they didn't show right here. The common ancestor to all animals, actually vertebrates. Okay, an ecosystem, all the living things and the non-living parts that interact together in a given area. When I say a given area, it could be like a forest, it could be a pond, it could be a desert, it could be a prairie. You probably talked about biomes in grade school. Those are different kinds of ecosystems, but these ecosystems will change due to events like hurricanes, blows the big trees over in a forest, flooding, volcanic overflow, fire. That really changes the ecosystem. It takes years for the ecosystem to come back, but we can observe that in our lifetime. Or if it was a big catastrophe, for example, a big killer asteroid hits the Earth, causes mass extinctions, then it takes millions of years for the ecosystem to bounce back. And it doesn't bounce back to what it was before. It has changed. Now, this is not necessarily evolution unless the species change. So what causes a species to change into another species? We're going to talk about that throughout this unit. Let's save that for now.